All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. My name is Macy Cheeks, and I am the co-founder of Blacks in IO Psychology. We are so excited to kick off the second webinar in our HBCU Task Force series. And this webinar is all about how to break into the field of IO, how to enter the field. So if you joined us last week, welcome back. And for all of you that are new here, I'd love to share a little bit more about us. So the HBCU Task Force, we are a group of IO professionals, all dedicated to ensuring that HBCU students have access to the field of IO psychology. And our goal is to connect students to academic and career pathways, increase diversity within the field, and to ultimately support the development of an IO psychology program on an HBCU campus. And so this initiative really grew out of the nonprofit that I co-founded back in 2019. So my co-founder and I, we both attended Howard University. So if there are any Bison in here, HU. And so we both attended Howard. We entered our graduate program for IO, and we realized that we were a bit behind the curve as compared to our graduate cohort. Some of our peers, they had more information about IO. Maybe they took an IO class in undergrad, or they came in a bit more prepared than we were. And so with that, we also noticed once we got into the field that there was a lack of diversity. So we created Blacks in IO to help ensure that access to IO psychology is equitable and inclusive. And so we host conferences annually. We have a mentorship program, scholarships. So definitely check us out. I'll put some information into the chat about us later. And so about today's webinar, the goal of this webinar is to help you all identify some courses that really will help you build a strong foundation for IO psychology, and to really understand how the right experience can prepare you for graduate study and a career in the field. And so I've linked a link to a toolkit in the chat. I'm just going to hit send real quick so you all have that. And so that is the toolkit that goes along with all of the sessions that we've been covering for the past, or for last week, and then the session we'll cover next week. But for this session specifically will coincide with the building your path and the skills for success sections. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted. Feel free to use the chat for questions, though. That's completely fine. So we'll be monitoring the chat throughout. This session is being recorded and will be shared out with everyone afterwards. And we'll be together for about an hour today, maybe about 30-ish minutes of content, and we'll spend the rest of the time answering questions for you all. And then wanting to touch on the agenda too, just so you all have some insight into what we are going to touch on today. So welcome and introductions here in a moment. We'll also cover just in general how to break into IO, what we're calling the recipe for this session. We'll talk through a little bit about a day in the life as an IO professional. We'll talk a bit about perfecting your recipe, so some advice from IO professionals, and then your next steps. And so with that, I would love to introduce our amazing speakers for today. So first we have Dr. Brandon Johnson. He's a strategic organizational leader and people analytics expert with over 15 years of experience applying IO psychology across public sector, higher education, and Fortune 500 organizations. He currently serves as Director of People and Culture for the Tennessee Board of Regents, where he leads HR strategy, workforce planning, and organizational development initiatives. Dr. Johnson holds a PhD and a master's in IO psychology from Auburn University and a bachelor's from Morehouse College. We are also joined by Brianna Bree Lockhart. Bree is an Associate Director of Human Resources and Operations at the Zero Emission Transportation Association. Bree is an accomplished HR and operations leader with over a decade of experience in HR strategy, employment law compliance, and organizational operations. In her current role, she built her organization's HR function from the ground up. Come on, Brie, I know that's right. She established the systems and processes to support a high performing team, and she holds multiple advanced degrees, including a master's in applied IO psychology. And so, with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Brandon to get us started.
Good evening, everybody. So we are talking about obviously how to break into IO psychology. And so really I wanted to kick this off by just kind of having you think about before we even talk about IO psychology, just to step back and kind of frame it in this manner. Why are you even attending college? I got asked this question, many moons ago. Why are you attending college? You can type it in the chat if you want to. But at the end of the day, you can say, "Oh, I want to make more money. I want to go into this specific field." But at the end of it, the meat and potatoes of it is that you want choices. You want to be able to have options and experiences. And I think that industrial organizational psychology is one of the areas where you'll really see that you have a lot of choices and a lot of different opportunities and a lot of different paths that you can explore. So we're going to just kind of dive into it. I will say that my personal career has just, gone from A to Z and back again. I started off actually in retail management. I won't say how long ago because I'm not going to insult myself with that information. But many, many moons ago, I was just, working in retail, and it started where I was doing more of the people operational work in retail. And then I looked up one day and I was like, I really don't like how this retail organization is run. And I thought to myself, what can I do about that? And that's sort of how I tumbled my way into IO. So I want to give you some of the information so hopefully you don't have to take such a circuitous path to get to where I got to. All right. So, talking about stocking the pantry. So, remember, again, we're talking about the recipe for IO. So, we're talking about stocking the pantry and thinking about those fundamental skills that you need that will set the right foundation. And again, this starts before you can even think about graduation. So, as many of you are in undergrad, you want to think about, what do I need to be successful in this field? What do I need to really be competitive for graduate school or in the workplace in general? We see all these shifts happening currently in real time in the workplace. What do you need to walk away from any sort of IO program and be successful in today's workforce? So I think the first piece of that is statistics. This is non-negotiable for me. Every IO path that you want to take lives downstream of stats in some form. If you can only take one course, I recommend that you take this course. I will say that, again, aging myself, when I was in high school, take it back there, I did not have the opportunity and access to a lot of those statistics courses, calculus, all of those sorts of things. They kind of capped me at algebra. I had to take courses at my local university with the approval and recommendation of some, teachers in high school. So, with that said, you've got access to that. And if you say, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not good at math, I don't know, I'm not really great with numbers, you need to get great with numbers. I spent the bulk of my time in graduate school making up for the things that I didn't have access to that you do have access to. I spent my Saturdays, 8, 9, 10 hours on a Saturday catching up. So while you have the opportunity to glean that information and to get that training, take it now before you get into a rigorous graduate school program or even before you enter the workforce and you need to call upon it. The next thing that we can talk about from a foundational perspective is research methods. So, this is going to teach you how to design studies, collect data, and avoid making some of those mistakes that may make any sort of outcomes that you find meaningless. So, a lot of grad programs do look for research methods, but beyond that, research methods in general will just help you in the workforce if you frame it the correct way. If you think about why are we asking this question? What are we hoping to see if we measure this? If you're going to issue out an employment survey, what's going to happen? What do you expect to happen? If you're entering some engagement survey, how do we use the data that we've collected? We have these wonderful findings. How do we actually apply the findings to get the next iteration within the workplace? So that's a very practical course that you're going to need. Organizational behavior. So this is giving you kind of all of the vocabulary that we get into the field. You'll find that in IO programs, people tend to say, they ask the question, do you lean more towards the I side or the O side? A lot of people love the O side because that's the fun stuff. That's where you get to come in, transform organizations, you get to do motivational things, you get to work with leadership and deal with group dynamics and culture, DE&I initiatives. That's all the fun stuff. People love that stuff. I love it. But this is our native language, right? The other piece of that, kind of adjacent to that is personnel psychology. This is the stuff more leaning towards the I side that a lot of people are going to be like, you know what? I don't know if I really want to do, all that organizational stuff. I kind of don't really want to deal with people. I'm a bit of an introvert, so that's why I'm a little bit more I leaning. So that's a lot of your selection, your assessment. We're talking about performance management. And this is, again, that's that industrial half of IO psychology. So whenever you apply for a job and they ask you to take that little, we'd like to give you a short assessment. It should take you no more than 15 minutes. An IO psychologist likely designed that for the organization. And then the last piece, again, very similar to statistics, we're talking about data analytics. This field has shifted significantly and seen a lot of growth in recent years. So, knowing how to work in an applied manner. So, think about all the statistics that you learn, but how do you apply it to your workforce? And that includes using tools like R, Python, Tableau. That's going to separate you as an applicant in 2026 and beyond. SQL, Power BI, Alteryx, Looker, being knowledgeable about, what tools, what big databases do we have, BigQuery, Snowflake, Redshift. Having knowledge of those sort of analytical tools is really going to distinguish you in a very competitive arena of the workforce now. Um, so we know that we have about a 12% projected growth within this field. But that number really does kind of undercount real demand because IO work typically sits within HR, it sits within consulting, it sits within analytics, and these fields may not be labeled IO at all, but they're drawing on the skills and talents of IO professionals. So here we're talking about building the flavor, skills that you need to know as a future IO psychologist. So we've already talked a little bit about research methods and statistics. These are table stakes. So if you can't design a study or interpret a regression, you can't do the work. So you've got to be able to interpret the results in a meaningful way, even if it says, you know what, we came to nothing. It was a null finding. But you can't say that in a workplace. Nobody cares that it was a null finding. Nobody cares that it was statistically significant. They want you to translate that into something meaningful. Um, so when we talk about again statistics, data analysis, these are survival skills, to be perfectly honest. I tell you that because you'll think that I'm lying, but you really do need these things to survive. If you go into a graduate program, you're going to need them to survive your graduate program. You're going to need them to survive your workplace. And you're going to have to work with all those tools possibly that I mentioned. And I mentioned them because the range is so vast. For some of you, you're going to enter a workplace and you're going to be working in Excel. And some of you are going to enter a workplace and you're going to have access to all the things that are out there. And it is also going to disturb you because now people are like, well, we've given you every tool. We've given you everything that you need to be successful. Why can't you do it? So you need to familiarize yourself now with those tools, so it doesn't, hinder your growth professionally as you advance. And when I say that this is important, I also want you to think about it. I'll use a practical example. So, forecasting, for example, I recently, in a budget meeting, had to kind of think through what our budget would be for some part-time employees at the organization. So that brings in a need to be able to forecast data, look at past trends, and see based upon past trends and current projections, where will we need to be in the future? That's some of the work that we practically do. You may have a finance person or budget analyst who does it, but you're in the best position as an IO professional to be able to speak to the organization in which you're embedded. So if you're in HR, you can help them position their arguments for what the budget should be for HR better if you have a command of these tools and this knowledge. Uh, Communication. Love it. You can run a perfect regression and lose your audience on the first slide. They do not know what you're talking about. They do not care what you're talking about. So you've got to practice translating for non-researchers, because you're going to find yourself in these organizations where communication really is a challenge, and you're going to find yourself even in a place where people say that they're so advanced and they're all about problem solving, and you're going to look up one day and be like, Tiffany Pollard, New York, and you'd be like, somebody lied to her several times and told her she was fly and beautiful and sexy, and she's nothing like that, that she's nothing of the sort. This organization will not be what you think it is. They will not have the acumen that you think that they possess or should come with. So it's your job to scale it in a way that makes sense for the leaders. You're going to have to translate all these complex things about engagement, all of these surveys that you're doing in a way that makes sense for them. And then the last piece, we're really going to talk about the problem solving, the consulting, the interpersonal skills. All of these things really work together. So IO practitioners diagnose problems, they recommend solutions, and they have to get comfortable with ambiguity. Now, when I talk about recommending solutions, here's what you'll find of most leaders. I've worked with several senior leaders in organizations from CHRO down. Most of the time, they want a bottom line figure. If they can't get a bottom line figure, they typically want two alternatives. So tell me what happens if I do X, and tell me what happens if I do Y. And then your job, you may want to go in there and say you should absolutely do X. Your job is to just say, here's what happens if you do X. Here's what happens if you do Y. Here are the potential fallouts of both actions, and leave it to the leader to ultimately make that decision. You can recommend all day long, but I would advise against saying you absolutely should do this, because many of you will enter into consulting spaces and you'll find yourself, oh, my feel like my back's against the corner. I'm going to tell them to do X. Well, if X blows up in their face, you're fired because you said it. You told them to do it. So you just want to get comfortable now with being able to say, here are your options. And this is, based upon the options that you have, this is what I might recommend. But ultimately, the choice is yours as an organization. And that's where those interpersonal skills really become valuable. This, at the end of the day, is a people-centered field. So you've got to be able to build trust quickly. The science doesn't always land if you don't, because you don't want to sit up here, over promising based on the science, and then you under deliver because in practice, this doesn't work. In practice, this isn't going to play out the way you think it'll play out. You'll want to have all of these amazing transformational efforts. Hey, we're going to implement Workday in our organization. I think I could be, of a huge help to that. And then guess what? What happens when you're dealing with an entire department that says, I don't like Workday and I want to do it the way I've been doing it? Now you're navigating that space and you've got to be able to juggle all of those different aspects of being in this field. Um, so just, think about that. We can go for it. Thank you. So, the secret sauce navigating the graduate program. So, really, there are two main paths here. We have track A, the master's path, and track B, the doctoral degree. Brianna may be able to offer some additional insight on the master's degree from her perspective at a later time. But I will say, the master's degree, a large focus on applied practice, as you can see there. And then this really is like the path of least resistance in terms of you get your hands dirty immediately. And people expect it to have more of that applied factor to it, right? I chose to go the path of track B, the doctoral degree. Now, there are pros and cons of both. Now, the master's degree, typically you'll find that a lot of individuals have to fund the master's degree themselves, meaning they're taking out loans of some sort, getting federal loans. Now, the upside of the doctoral path, if you're 100% you want to go that route, is that it's typically funded by the organization. You may have to teach some classes. I had to teach IO psychology. I had to teach general psychology. I had to teach statistics. So I had to do some teaching for my very small stipend, but at the end of the day, I did not have to fund my master's or my PhD because I got them both on the way to getting the PhD. So my organization did that funding. I also got additional funding because I went to a PWI and did some work there, just mentoring other minorities in that space. So there are tons of different options and considerations depending on what you feel you want to commit to. And that's really about where your position is in life. For some of you who just want to get in, get out, and you say, hey, I just really want this master's degree because I want to get my hands dirty quickly. I want to get in the field. You're going to learn all the things that you really need to know. I basically just spent extra years fighting with people on a committee. So it's really about the path that you want to take that makes sense for you, depending on what you have going on in terms of, relationships, all of those factors, all of those will inform the decision that works best for you. But you do, as you're thinking about those things, I'll go back to the piece about relationship building. You want to build those relationships, authentic relationships early on. You really want to have someone who is ultimately in your corner. I had a professor who asked me, a very, poignant question and says, "Oh, so what do you want to do?" And at the time, I was, sold on I am going to be a clinical psychologist. That's what I'm doing that. You can't stop me. And she was like, "It's never going to happen." And I said, "Excuse me?" Beg to differ. And so that pushed me in a way to work extremely aggressively to prove her wrong. And at the end of that time, she said, I actually just wanted to see what you were made of. I wanted to see if you had the chops to go, you can go whatever path you take. I ultimately ended up taking the path of IO psychology because it was a better fit for me. But again, those options, having somebody push me, having somebody advocate for me in that way. Um, and then the other piece of it that you're not going to see is just say yes. It seems so very, simple, but a large part of what I consider to be my success has been based upon the fact that I said yes when nobody else said anything. I'm sitting in a room and somebody says, "Oh, who wants to, lead this project?" And it's super quiet. That's the time when your hand should fly up and say, "I'll do it. I'll take it." Obviously, again, you don't want to overcommit, but you want to be the person who's, jumping on top of every opportunity because it's going to help pave the way for whatever path you choose in terms of graduate programs. All right, so here we talk about mixing the ingredients and gaining applied experience. So I consider myself to be a bit of a home cook. I like to troll all of Instagram looking for different things to cook. And there's a basic cornbread recipe. And what is it? It's cornmeal, little yellow cornmeal, some flour, a couple of eggs, some milk, a little baking powder, a little bit of salt, and you need some sort of oil or butter, right? And so that's going to give you a solid foundation. That's going to give you a pretty, basic, good cornbread. But then, as you're talking about mixing the ingredients, what happens if you throw in a little cheese and some jalapenos? What happens if I switch it from regular milk, whole milk to buttermilk? And so we think about those things that uniquely make it ours. So what makes this my own? It started out, I have the foundation, but how do I make this my own? How do I create my own experience? My experience is insane for lack of a better word. I left graduate school. I moved to California. I worked at Tesla. I was in the benefits department at Tesla. I left that and I went to work for local government. And even in local government, I started off in, kind of this coordinator role, and I became the city's first industrial organizational psychologist. That led me to actually creating the organizational development department, which I later became the director of. So when I talk about being able to carve out your own path with that solid foundation, you're going to think about things a little bit differently in a way that says, hey, what if we did this? What if we moved this here? It would make more sense if we worked on this. And I got a chance to do a lot of cool work. I have been part of police and fire testing, for entry and promotional testing. When I moved to Atlanta, I worked for the CDC. So I got to be there in the heyday of COVID. So I mean, there really is no limit in terms of mixing everything together. Seek out those research labs. If you are, lucky enough to have someone who does that kind of work on campus, by all means, seek them out. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat that, oh, I think it would be good to take like a business course. That is an untapped market. If you don't have an IO psychology program, you likely have a business school. And so you're able to go into that business school and they're going to do some of the same work. Business schools gave me plenty of opportunities I was actually on a project that looked at patient safety behavior in nursing populations. I got access to that project because I took a statistics course in a business school, for graduate school. So I'm saying don't limit yourself to your opportunities that you think, oh, it's got to look exactly like this in order for me to be successful. Just be open. Because all it was a quick conversation. Would you be interested? I think you do well here. Boom. That gave me some more money in graduate school. And you're always looking for money in graduate school. So applied internships, seek HR, talent acquisition. Again, do all the things that you want to do, in terms of just being open to whatever experience you may have. I have largely been embedded in HR. I like HR. I also like to teach. I like for people to grasp material. So I've done a lot of learning and development, professional development within the workplace, and 100% about, in terms of organizational development, looking at cultures and how we think about that behavior. And I know that a lot of work has been done in recent years in that space, and you're going to have to navigate even that, differently per depending on your organization. So you need to be equipped with the tools to help you do that. And then lastly, when we talk about campus involvement, again, take any kind of leadership role that you can within any organization. At Morehouse, I actually sang in the Glee Club and in the quartet, and then I was also the treasurer. And I just did a whole bunch of stuff. And you jump into all these organizations and just get your hands dirty. Um, Graduate school. I consulted for the entire college. So whatever they needed from a consulting perspective, I worked on, and I would bring in peers, book chapters, all of the things. Your name doesn't have to be first on that kind of stuff, especially if you choose to get your PhD. Um, I quite literally have my name on things for, 5 sentences that I wrote. And that's not to be like, oh, you don't have to do any work. It's just like that was my contribution, and I was acknowledged for the contribution. There may have been many hours behind those 5 sentences, but still, it's an opportunity to get yourself out there and do some of that work. And so, these final career paths. Let me tell you something. I've worked in absolutely all of these. Tech and innovation, I worked at Tesla when they were building the Gigafactory in Nevada. Um, I, was in the mix of all of it. I have done some work for Google. I have done some work for Amazon. You can get into these spaces oftentimes, even if you're doing like part-time stuff. You can jump into that space and just be like, they may need an ad hoc researcher, an extra set of hands. You can always jump into those. I have done formal consulting, places like Deloitte. Don't really enjoy that. It's not necessarily for me. Those are long hours and there's an intense client demand for that piece. So you will get a client request at 4 a.m. and be expected to respond at 4:05. So I didn't quite enjoy that. It's a little bit easier if you can get in with like a boutique firm that may be in your city. But yeah, the expectation is greater when people hire consultants because they're paying a place like Deloitte a lot of money and they expect a return on that investment. So you do have to be kind of up at all times of the day. Government and public sector, that's actually some of my favorite work. Government and public sector is an opportunity for you definitely make a meaningful change in any organization, but I feel as if that's some of the change that you can really see. It's tangible. For example, when I was at the city of Memphis, I reworked police hiring to make it more efficient for us to actually bring more police into the city and more potential candidates for police into the city. What does that mean? We're, one of the top cities in crime, right? So, hey, we need police officers. I did work to help bring us police officers and ease the process. So I do think a lot of that work is meaningful. Again, when I was at the CDC, opportunity to do the same sort of meaningful work to make it easier for researchers to delve into things like COVID unencumbered. So we want to think about, work in those sectors as being very critical and very important. And then the other piece of it, and we're seeing it flow a little bit better. But the other piece of it is typically in government and public sector, the salary's listed, so you know exactly what you're getting into before you play this game of round robin with recruiters. So you have a better chance at being able to say, hey, I think this job is within the parameters that I would be willing to accept for this pay. And then lastly, again, done healthcare and corporate HR. Lot of teamwork, team building in those spaces. And a lot of strategy. And again, I've done a little bit of everything, workforce development, workforce planning. So whenever your organization goes through a reorg, I typically have probably been involved in that. And when they say, hey, we need to restructure, we need to reorganize some things, what's redundant in our workforce, as we're seeing so many people, unfortunately, in the midst of all of these different layoffs, you may be part of those decisions to help us really honestly think through as an organization where are we seeing some bloat and some excess because a lot of organizations were so quick to grab onto talent and then now they're having to let people go for various reasons, and so part of the work that you do may inform that. So you really have a lot of different options that you can take depending on what you're interested in. Some some of those places, like a Google, is still pretty much a you really need to know somebody to get in. And Amazon is going to give you a battery of tests before you get in. A place like Johnson and Johnson, battery of tests before you get in. You're going to have to go through a lot of screenings to get through that process with them, but it's certainly doable. And whatever path you choose, the benefit of being an IO psychologist is, hey, maybe you get tired one day and you want to go teach. Or I have done adjunct work, just little things that I'm just like, I'm tired of thinking about corporate all day. What else can I do? What else can I think about? So I loved being able to have those opportunities as well. So, definitely a field where there are not a ton of limits, in terms of what you can do.
Alrighty, I will be taking over for Brandon. Hello again, my name is Brianna, and I'm so thankful to be here to share my journey and what that looks like in my day-to-day. For a little background, I graduated from Hampton University, the other HU, so shout out to my home by the sea, with a degree in sociology and absolutely no idea what IO psychology was. And I can honestly say that my path was anything but traditional and it was HR adjacent at best, but it was always driven by a genuine curiosity and innate pull towards people. So I've navigated through hospitality, aviation, telecommunications, government affairs, and C-suite support before I even found my footing in HR. And even then, IO psychology landed in my lap years after that. But what I can say is that each organization showed me how they work and how they show up for the people inside of them. And that's what led me to where I am now. So if you're sitting there listening and you're a current student and you're wondering if you're in the right major or whether it's too late to pivot or whether the field is actually accessible to someone with your background or lack of introduction to IO, I'm sitting in front of you as your answer. And the answer is yes. So what I'm going to do is walk you through what that actually looks like in practice. And during the introduction, it was mentioned that I currently work for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and I serve as their Associate Director of Human Resources and Operations. And for nearly 2 years now, I've been a one-woman team. And last week alone, I rewrote a compliance policy to reflect change in DC employment law, ran structured interviews for an open role we're currently hiring for. I've processed payroll and audited our benefits data, and I worked on recognition and professional development framework for our staff. And I think the biggest highlight was I advised our executive director on a sensitive workforce decision that had to be made. No week is one size fits all, and neither is an IO role, but this is what it looks like for me. And I can break it down based on the pillars that I focus on in IO specifically. So when I joined my team, there was no HR function. There were no systems, no processes, no infrastructure, just a team of talented people doing work with no formal people operations behind them. So when I joined, I was their sole HR and employment law practitioner for the entire dual entity organization. So that meant every decision, every process, and every framework had to be built from scratch by me and often in real time while the organization is still moving, having to have a rapid response. So the first thing I addressed was people already there. Before I could bring on anyone new, I needed to make sure our existing team had a foundation to stand on. So that meant building performance management framework that defined what good performance looked like. At Zeta, we established clear expectations for each role and created the structure and documentation that leadership needed to have meaningful, consistent conversations with our team about growing and accountability. At an organization our size, which is roughly about 10 people, plus a few external stakeholders, I own the performance management function entirely. So that means building framework, designing the tools, establishing a cadence, and making sure our executive director has everything to walk into those conversations prepared, consistent, and confident. And together, those pieces turn performance conversations from informal check-ins to intentional, documented, growth-oriented dialogue. And that aspect of IO psychology is performance management science, making sure that you have clear expectations for everyone so that you're not just going off of a gut feeling. No one who interviewed well, even though someone could be the top candidate, but they were a little nervous, or those who didn't pass the vibe check, as we like to say now with the young folks. But it gave us a consistent evidence-based framework that every panelist used the same way, so that every candidate got a fair shot and every hiring decision could be based off of merit and defended by that as well. And that aspect was selection science that we deal with on a daily basis. And then there's the compliance work that I do. I know I mentioned rewriting policy. So, rewriting that policy language to reflect changes in employment law, which is not just a legal exercise I do for fun, but the IO layer underneath it is about understanding how policy shapes behavior inside of organizations. So, the language you use in a policy communicates what your organization actually values, and not just what it says it values on paper or on the website or in our employee handbook. And that gap between stated values and lived experience is one of the most important things an IO practitioner learns to identify and close the gap on. So every time you design a system that affects people and how they're hired, evaluated, or held accountable, you're doing IO work, whether you know it or not. And that's what I'm doing as a team of one, and that's what I am pushing for more people like you, looking like me, to come into the field and do as well. The second place where IO psychology shows up in my daily work is how I think about people, specifically what keeps them engaged, motivated, and invested in the work that they're doing. So at Zeta, we're a small but mighty team, and in small organizations, engagement isn't abstract. You can feel it immediately when someone's doing well, they're happy, they're pleased, but you can also feel it just as immediately when something is off. So part of my work has been building a recognition practice for our team, and not just a generic program where you get a pizza party or you get to leave the office a few hours early, but I've been working to build something intentional and grounded in what we actually know about motivation. IO psychology tells us that recognition lands differently depending on the person. What feels meaningful to one employee might feel hollow to another. So, how you design recognition matters as much as whether you do it at all. And a good comparison is how one of our teammates wanted to do an axe throwing get together for our holiday party, and the other one just wanted to do a simple dinner. You go home and relax afterwards. So it's finding that happy balance and medium so that everyone feels recognized and invested in just the same. And in line with that, I've also been building out our professional development framework for the team. So because sustained engagement isn't just about feeling appreciated in that moment, it's about people able to see a path forward in terms of their growth, a signal that the organization sees them as more than the role they currently feel and that they want to invest in them to grow in their own areas. So, both of these things, recognition and development, are motivation science in practice. They're rooted in what decades of IO research tells us actually sustains people's investment in their time over work. And engagement isn't just a feeling you hope to have, it's an outcome you design it for. And IO psychology, from my experience, has given me and others like you the framework to design it intentionally and really make an impact on those who you're working with on a daily basis. And the third aspect that I focus on mainly in my work is the least expected, but I love this aspect of HR, and it's being able to shed the layer and the assumption that compliance and paperwork is mostly what HR does. And yet it is true. That's a part of it, especially with employment law and considering all of that. But the work that I enjoy the most is when I'm able to sit face to face with our executive director and translate people science into organizational strategy, or in a language that he understands as business impact or business results, so that he's able to understand it as well. So recently, going into, I advised my executive director through a sensitive work decision. And the question I kept bringing back to the table wasn't just, is this the right legal move and what's most efficient for the outcome of our team? But it was, how do I land this appropriately and effectively for our people? What does this communicate about how we are as an organization? And how do we protect the culture that we've built while navigating something genuinely difficult? And that aspect of IO psychology is organizational development, and that is change management informed by IO principles. And it requires you to hold the legal, the human, and the organizational all at once, excuse me, which is exactly the kind of practitioner that I've been shaping myself to be, and that is built by IO backgrounds. So topics such as workforce planning, organizational structure decisions, culture stewardship during uncertainty, that is strategic HR, but is also IO psychology at its highest application. And for that, you don't need to wait until you hold a VP title or you have a PhD to do this work. You just need the framework and the lens, as you can see with most master's programs. And that's what that foundation gives you. And then you just need to be willing, to even use it when conversations are hard, when you face these executive directors, VPs, or other stakeholders. And so, before I hand it back, I just wanted to leave a few things with you and also reiterate what's already been said. But the field of IO psychology is growing faster than almost any other occupation, if not the same. Organizations across every industry are waking up to the fact that their biggest competitive advantage isn't their product or their technology, but it's their people. And they need practitioners who understand the science behind people work. So beyond the market opportunity, this field needs you specifically. It needs HBCU educated, community rooted, culturally informed practitioners who bring lived experience into rooms that have historically lacked it. The perspective you all bring, what I bring, what Brandon brings, is the community you've lived in, your lived experience, and your background. That's exactly what this field's been missing, and that's exactly why it needs each and every one of you. So my advice before closing out is that your path doesn't have to be perfect whatsoever. Mine wasn't. But stop waiting for the perfect major, the perfect moment, or the perfect opportunity to start building your path. And before you close out tonight, just write down one concrete thing that you are going to do in the next 30 days to move towards this field or to explore your curiosity a little further. So not 6 months from now, because I know I can put something on the back burner and come back to it next year, but within 30 days, whether you look into a course that you're interested in, reach out to one person on the panel, or find someone on LinkedIn, or one organization on your campus or externally to get plugged into. You have Buy Up right here, Brandon and myself, and then the HBCU task force. So you're always more than welcome to connect with us as a group or individually, but just know that you're not behind and you're not too late. And you're already on stage and taking the first step to lead into a field that greatly needs you. So that is my spiel on what I do.
Awesome. So I believe I'm picking it up again with the discussion and Q&A. And so I invite, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat. Be more than happy to do our best to answer those for you. But we can kind of, again, thinking about the pieces that you want to reflect on. So from a skills and knowledge perspective, what do you need to really shore up based on what we've talked about tonight? I typically find that people really need to shore up analytics. That's why I push it as much as I do. Um, Brianna brought to light, I think, another important part. That's employment law. I do a lot of work if I am not directly working with general counsel. I am having to interpret correctly employment law myself. So there's a lot of work that happens within that space, especially if you're adjacent to HR. So you may need to shore that up. Think about the undergraduate courses, the experiences, the internships that you want to pursue. Again, business schools are a good option if you need to think outside the box a little bit. And honestly, you'll find you really just need to ask. If there is an IO psychologist in your area, most of the time they will be like, I absolutely have something you can do. Now, whether it's paid or not is a different story, but they probably have something you can put your hands on to gain access and experience in that area. And then think through, how this may inform your goals in the future. So I'll see if the questions are out there. If not, I have a couple that I typically get that I'm more than happy to answer and also have anybody else's input on. So we've kind of touched on this already. Do you need a PhD to work in IO? Absolutely not. And I do want to be very clear about that. The master's is going to give you the majority of the applied material you need, the talent management, the consulting pieces, selection and assessment. The PhD, a lot of people kind of relegate this to being the right path if you want to go to academia or if you have specialized research. I had specialized research. By way of anecdote, I will say that well over a decade ago, I had a question about whether bullying and incivility could be distinguished as separate constructs within a virtual work environment. Guess what? We're virtual now. Everybody's working virtually. And so within that context at the time, my research found that all incivility was perceived as bullying when you're working online. So at the time I had to fight a committee because they were like, it's not enough research. Nobody who's really going to work online. And I was like, now cut to 2026, everybody is. So you also can't be shy about pursuing the things that honestly interest you and that you feel are thoughtful questions that may need to be answered. Uh, let's see. Another question that I typically get is how competitive are IO programs? Again, they're pretty competitive, especially if you're saying I want a PhD in it, because typically the PhDs in IO psychology, you acquire your master's along the way and they're funding that entire process. So they're giving you money to go to school. Obviously, they're taking a couple of people. And the other piece that's critical is normally for the PhD, you're applying to work in somebody's specialty. So you're not just saying, hey, I want to study IO. This program is an IO program. You're usually applying to a specific researcher within that program who's gonna say, "Hey, I study, what it's like work-life balance," and that's what my research focuses on. So if you say, "I'm interested in work-life balance, I want to work with you," then make sure that you're building skills and acquiring experiences that support wanting to work in that area. I chose experimental psychology, so before there was IO most IOs of a certain age studied experimental psychology. So being able to just get your hands dirty in those spaces and figuring out what interests you is always good, especially if you want to pursue a graduate program at that level. And then lastly, the third question that I say I get frequently is what is the pay like? And that is a wonderful question. Let me tell you something. Your boy is comfortable. Um, that obviously comes with age and experience, but I will say that I've been comfortably rocking six figures for some years. And it's not an inaccessible thing at all. And I'm not talking about, entry. I'm talking about, we're in there, deep in the pocket. And so as you acquire those experiences, and especially as you become good at translating all this scientific information into practical application and communicating it in a way that makes sense to executive leaders, you'll find that you'll get more in there than you thought even possible. And that is phenomenal to see, especially when I consider the fact that when I entered my program, it was 2% minorities all around. So we've seen tremendous growth and we'll continue to see tremendous growth. And you want to be part of that while it's still somewhat in its infancy. So I will see if there are no other questions. I'll turn it back over to our host here.
Hey, Brandon, yeah, there were a couple. There was one that I was just answering in the chat about book recommendations. So I think that takes us right into our next slide. So I can pick up from here. Amaya, you are a paid actor because that was literally our next our next slide. So here are some what we say the chef's library, some required reading for you all. Definitely, if you can get your hands on these books, these are going to be some great foundations. We also have some resources and books that we would recommend in the toolkit that you all receive the link to. We have two full resource pages. We have books, podcasts, YouTube series that will really be helpful in your journey. So here are a few books. Here are some additional resources for you all. So newsletters you can sign up for, scholarship information, internship information, some partner organizations that you all can consider joining, that and they have their own resources, right, to help support your growth and development in this field. You all will get a copy of this deck. You all have the link to the toolkit. So definitely start there with your research for books and podcasts and things of that nature. I'm going to pause real quick just to see if there are any other questions that popped up before we wrap up. Any advice you could provide in order to prep for the first year Masters in IO? Brandon, any quick hit
Yeah.
advice?
I will say that the first, your master's is really going to be aggressive. Remember, that's your foundational knowledge. So it does not matter whether you're pursuing the PhD or just the master's. That is foundational stuff and it's super aggressive. So you really have to manage your time well. You have to keep up with everything. There is no going out like that. There is no hanging out like that. It's going to take over your life for the time that you're in it. So just breathe and be prepared that it will take over.
For sure. For sure. And then the last piece of from King asked a question about AI. Where do we see AI creating the most value in IO? Any quick thoughts on that? If not, we can definitely get that question answered offline for you, King, and follow up via email. But Brandon, Bree, any quick hit thoughts about AI's
I
value in IO?
I think more recently, especially since I'm hiring right now, I like to use it to help with the vetting process to make sure I'm getting qualified candidates. But what I've noticed is and where I draw the line is that before pushing anyone through or giving it to my team, I'll just do a quick review because after continued use, it does operate in a bias. So you just have to check it every once in a while and make sure if you're using the same system that it's not operating in a bias and eliminating particular candidates because that's a whole nother world of trouble that you don't want to get into. So I like it to help cut down on the process, but I also like to put eyes on everything before moving anyone forward or connecting with my team. So it's helpful in hiring, but it does have its limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that insight, Bree. All righty. So let's go ahead and wrap up. So what's next in this series? We have one additional webinar coming up next week on Monday. So please go ahead and register for that. It's going to be at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. If you've already registered for this session, you registered for the first session, we are recommending go ahead and register for the third session as well, just so we can make sure we're getting the right content and resources to your email directly for the webinar next week. I'm just hitting send on a chat for you all that has a link to our survey. Please fill out the survey based on today's session. You do have a chance to win $50 after you complete the survey. That will really help us ensure that we are connecting appropriately with the content makes sense to you all. It's covering everything that you all have questions on, and it'll help us as we continue on in building out future webinars like this. And then the toolkit. So I know I talked about the toolkit a bit. You all have a link in this chat. I'll also send a link to your email. That toolkit has a wealth of information, right? A place to jot down your next steps that Bree talked about, right? Your next steps, the things that you want to focus on for the next 3 months. There's several opportunities within that toolkit for you all to really start planning out your roadmap. There's a full course load planner in there as well, right? So it has a resource you can take to your professor or your advisor to show them and say, hey, I want to get started on the path toward IO. Here are some classes that the HBCU task force is suggesting. How can I fit this into my schedule and ensure that I can get started down the right path? So use that toolkit, guys. It's there for you. And then finally, big thank you to Brandon and Bree for sharing your time, your amazing insights with us today. We really, really appreciate you all being here, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks so much, everyone, and take care.